World's Fairs in Chicago as documents of time and place, this time on the Everything is a Primary Source podcast. Engaging students with authentic learning experiences is essential to being an effective teacher. Here's the 2026 New Hampshire Teacher of the Year, Megan Philbrook, speaking about her experience with my primary source borrowing service, EPS2Go, which aims to do just that.
Going above just our standards is really, really important to grab our learners and engage them. And I think that's what your kits really do. It's a museum in a box that comes to your classroom that makes our teaching lives so much easier. So once I had my first taste of your kits, I knew that there's something here that we social studies teachers really need to draw upon more. So that finalist visit is your last round to kind of show off and showcase what you can do and why you should be New Hampshire Teacher of the Year. And with my primary source kit, I would like to think, of course, that I definitely wowed the selection committee. There was just something in there for every single person that came to visit, and my students were right in the history, and you couldn't ask for more.
If you'd like to learn more about how EPS2Go can bring an authentic history experience directly to your classroom, visit everything-history.com/EPS2Go today. Welcome to the Everything is a Primary Source podcast, the show where we navigate history through popular culture. I'm your host, Eric Salmonson. I'm a social studies teacher, historian, and pop culture enthusiast. Each episode, I sit down with everyday people to discuss the media, objects, places, and events that shape us and reveal what they say about the past, as well as who we are now. The Everything is a Primary Source podcast is, therefore, your history, my history, our history through popular culture. John, I'm so glad that you stopped by my table today and you found something from my collection that you thought you would like to talk about for a little while. First of all, tell us a little bit about yourself. What's your background and why are you here at the New Hampshire Council for the Social Studies Conference?
All right. Well, thanks for having me. It was hard to not be drawn into your table with all this terrific stuff that, some people might say, oh, that's just ephemera, but, it's all the great cultural history of the past. I teach history at Plymouth State, and a lot of my students are going to be teachers of history and social studies, and the history program there is combined with social studies education program, so we have sort of a joint program, so that I came here a couple decades ago and ended up getting recruited into the New Hampshire Council for the Social Studies because of the work I did, and I ended up working for the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History in New York City as their state representative or coordinator for their annual award for the New Hampshire History Teacher of the Year. And so I just a few minutes ago gave that award away to this year's winner, Jonathan Brower from the Brewster Academy in Wolfboro. And so then I came into this great hall here where I saw all this cool stuff on your table. So that's what brings me here.
So you selected a deck of cards. I've had these for a little while. I found them at the back of a bin at a Goodwill by the Pound in Rochester, New York. And it's a Columbian Exposition souvenir playing card set. And when I found them, I thought they were just a regular set of playing cards because it seems like the decided on color motif for most of playing cards for all of eternity are either blue and white or red and white.
It almost looks like a bicycle.
Right, I thought it was. And I was like, okay, this is just, and then I looked at it, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is an actual souvenir. So if nothing else it tells us about any time period is that people, and I think we can assume this, played cards in that time period. But of course they did. That's what it was all about. The question I have for you isn't so much about the playing cards themselves, but where was it made, and I suppose why, and what locations are associated with it. So tell us a little bit about what you uncovered when you're looking at these cards.
Well, that's a great question for so many reasons, and one of them is because you've asked about its location, and there's a really interesting geographical element to my answer. So where was it made? So I'm going to have to make some assumptions here, but this is from the Columbian World's Fair of 1893, really kicking off in 1892. So it was celebrating 1492. Now here we are a few hundred years later in 1892, and Christopher Columbus sailing the ocean blue in 1492. It's 1892, so they called it the Columbian World's Fair.
Quadricentennial,
yes, very good, very good. So, if you look at the deck of cards, you'll see what an artist imagined Christopher Columbus looked like on one side of it, and actually, when you pull the cards out, you can see him and his crew landing on shore, on land. Yes. Of course, we don't actually know what Christopher Columbus looked like. There's many different busts and paintings of him. So I'm going to assume that this was made in Chicago because it was the Chicago World's Fair, which is now they have like Soldier Field, and if you go into Chicago, it's just east of the Loop, all along the waterfront. It's a huge, huge area to house what was appropriately called the World's Fair. You know, people from all around the world were expected to come, but as well as Americans were sort of encouraged to come so that they could see where America stood in relation to the rest of the world. So there would be lots of trains that were specially chartered from all parts of the country to come into Chicago, so that this very sort of middle class, more prosperous working class expeditions for families to see. Kind of before they had Disneyland, Disney World, right? This was the thing to go to, a World's Fair. So they didn't have them every year, and they were big things. And so I actually was kind of drawn to your table because you have many pieces of ephemera from various World's Fair, and my own personal connection. I think that was one of the questions that I saw on the table. You might be asked about your personal connection to it. I don't have a personal connection to this one, but in 1904, which was just celebrating 100 years of the Louisiana Purchase, the year before that, they had the Louisiana expedition, Meet Me in St. Louis, and I write all the songs and all that stuff. And my dad's grandmother, my dad's mother's mother, had this seashell ornament from that expedition, and I have it in my office where I do work. And it's just like a little connection to a distant family, and so I just have always had a special place in my heart, I guess, for like World's Fairs, and it's a place, especially as a cultural historian like yourself, would find really interesting stuff going on because they're celebrating American culture, they're situating it in world culture, they're celebrating the past, and there's just so many really cool things going on.
I feel like they're cheering us. That was a great explanation. I feel like there's it shares a lot of similarities like the Olympics, where you have a World Congress, you have people coming in, but World's Fairs, of course, were not centric on sports by any means. Right. It was everything else. So it was kind of like what Epcot was trying to replicate.
Absolutely.
As a fellow educator, I know that taking our social studies classes to historical sites and museums can be a rewarding experience for everyone involved. But between coordinating transportation, keeping track of permission slips, and paying out of pocket for unforeseen expenses, it can also be a large task for a busy teacher. The Everything is a Primary Source to Go artifact borrowing service replicates the most engaging part of a museum field trip, and that's interacting with real historic objects directly in your classroom, but without the process and cost of taking your class off campus. The Everything is a Primary Source archive contains ephemera and physical objects dating from the 1820s onward, with emphasis on the 20th century. Pre-made and curated kits pull from the collection and are designed to complement your curriculum, just as the exhibits at your favorite cultural center do. Visit everything-history.com to learn more about EPS to Go and how it can help you bring the museum to your classroom. it shares qualities to some extent with the Olympics, or would mirror what we'd have in, say, like Epcot Center in Walt Disney World. And I can only imagine that Walt Disney himself, who's a Midwestern guy, probably had, I know he never got to live to see Epcot, but he probably had things like the Columbian Exposition and the St. Louis Fair in his mind.
Sure, and he certainly lived through the pretty monumental New York World's Fair of 1939.
Carousel of Progress. Well, that was the 60s one, but and It's a Small World was at the 60s one in New York.
That's right. So he actually ends up blending into that nicely in that way. What was interesting about the New York World's Fair of 39 was it was focused on like this notion of Tomorrowland, which of course we see in Disneyland, Disney World today.
Yeah.
But so many World's Fairs look backwards. So like St. Louis looking back to the Louisiana Purchase, and Chicago looking back to Christopher Columbus. In 1939, right, in the midst of a world turmoil, because World War II is about to begin, there's a lot of sort of fears about it starting. It's looking forward to a more prosperous, right? We're coming out of the Great Depression, right? Wouldn't it be great to have a wonderful future of peace and prosperity? So to take a step back, I think that really going back to the Columbian World's Fair in Chicago, I really like your connection to Epcot, and what is interesting to think about if you think about it from Olympics, right? Olympics is a place for the countries of the world, the nations of the world, to compete against each other and show off who's best in the moment. And the way a lot of Americans treated the World's Fairs that they built every few years was to actually use it as a way to prove to the rest of the world that Americans were the best. So it had that competitive element to it without it being sports. So it was really cultural superiority. So you go to a building that emphasized modern technology, and so you can think about the exposition of 1876 was emphasizing electricity and Alexander Graham Bell and all these neat things that American businesses and innovators.
Diet soda was introduced there too.
The Ferris wheel, which is again getting back to that amusement element that happens. So to go right back to your original question, I presume this was made in Chicago or Illinois. It certainly was sold there. I've never seen a deck of cards from there, so this is a really great souvenir. So I was connecting it to how my own great grandmother had a souvenir. This was something that people wanted to remember. The World's Fair was an experience and take home a little piece.
Yeah, and I'm guessing. I mean, we made that assumption at the beginning that people obviously must have played cards. You can get playing cards now. I mean, they're not, and I'm assuming super cheap to make. They're not. This one seems to be a little bit more elaborate because each card actually has printed onto it a hand-drawn or hand-painted image of one of the exposition buildings of each of the different states, and kind of a state's opportunity to showcase what it's all about, which is kind of like what's going to happen next month for the National Council for the Social Studies Conference in Washington. Good place for that, right? All the states in some way or another represented there. We can imagine that the intended audience for these are probably just like the fair itself, mostly Americans, and that they would be taking this home with them to share what they saw with people that didn't have the opportunity to make it. That's my guess. But
so I'll point out a couple of things. So, and since we're right here in New Hampshire, we should point out that the Four of Hearts card has the New Hampshire building on it. So it was a place where every state had its own building, but also countries of the world had their own building. So here on the Three of Clubs, we have the Sweden building. And why I said initially why your question being geographically focused was really interesting is because there was a geography within the World's Fairs. And so that in the pavilion that emphasized America's place in the world, the biggest building was the United States building, and it was dead set center in the middle of the exposition. And then as you moved one building to the right, you'd see, there's the United Kingdom building, and one building to the left, there's the French building, and then another building to the right, there's the German building. And it kind of created this sort of scale, a ladder of progress almost, where the biggest, the most central, and the best was the United States. So that's why I kind of like that notion of international competition. So people from all around the world, countries would send representatives to this. So not only did we have the various states also being represented, so that Americans could see how diverse and interesting their country was, also the territories of the United States were represented. And so it was seen as a very educational kind of thing. So that's why I kind of like the aspect of your question about the locations that are associated with it, but really the locations are the whole world. The notion of being a nation of many states, of having territories, and sort of the internal geography of it is kind of interesting.
I've never gone through and actually looked at each card, but we know that a deck of cards has 52. And at that time, there weren't 50 states, but it was closing in on that.
Yeah.
We're talking, high 40s. Arizona and New Mexico hadn't been joined to the Union yet, I don't think. That would come for a while. Alaska and Hawaii, of course, were still pretty far out. But I wonder if each state has its card, and then after that, who do they decide which countries get the other ones? Is it? And I guess the last kind of puzzle I have is why Chicago? Is it just because it was the fastest growing and most exciting city of the time? Because the St. Louis one makes sense. Gateway to the West. It's Missouri is the first state to be created out of Louisiana Purchase, so it makes sense they would have that related to it. That's where you'd host it. Wouldn't it make more sense to do a celebration of Columbus? And Columbia is also the woman, the embodiment of America, is also on that card depicted. Would it make sense?
Washington is the District of Columbia.
Right. Shouldn't it be in Washington? Wouldn't that make sense? Or Florida, closer to where he actually landed? He never actually came to continental America. So it's like, why Chicago? I guess is it just because of how exciting the city was and how centrally located it is?
Yeah, well, I think it also goes back to that notion that these fairs in some ways were a pivot in people conceiving where they have been and looking in the past and thinking about where they're moving into the future. And so Chicago, sort of the second city of the United States, we even have second city comedy, we're harking back to that name. But it was also like the biggest city out in the West. It was the frontier. And it was the frontier becoming civilized. It was the frontier kind of becoming modern. And so just as Christopher Columbus had traveled west, right, and discovered, areas that from his perspective needed civilizing and uplifting, right? In a sense, Chicago was representing the fruition of that dream. So there's actually a very interesting connection to the notions of frontier and that exposition, because the American Historical Association held its annual convention there. So this was a meeting place of organizations from around the world.
Wasn't the Democratic National Convention with William Jennings Bryan's famous Cross of Gold speech? It was in Chicago. I want to say it was like that same year, maybe.
Well, I think the Cross of Gold speech was actually a couple years later in '96.
Okay, but in Chicago,
it was. But although it's quite possible, knowing Bryan, that he was recirculating a speech he gave a couple years earlier.
Yeah, he would give that one, and he recorded it later on just for posterity purposes. But I'm curious if Chicago also acts as like this emblem for populism, and because populism is the ultimate Western, political thing that it gives back to the East.
Right, and in the election of 1892 is really where you see their first making a small dent in the national political scene. 19 '96 again is a really big election.
Yeah, I always find it funny in that speech where he kind of says, like, destroy the cities and they'll regrow within a day, because of farms, but get rid of the farms and I'm like, you're in a city.
He says, burn down your cities and they will be rebuilt.
Well, burn
down your farms and grass will grow in the cities.
It's like, and you're in a city saying that, so be careful, just take it easy.
So one of the most famous historical papers ever presented was by a historian named Frederick Jackson Turner, and it became known as the Turner Thesis or the Frontier Thesis. And he really laid into the notion that the spirit of America was a frontier spirit, and so it was all these people moving from Europe into the challenging coastal areas of the New World, where democracy was reborn, and hard work had to be used, and everybody was kind of leveled and picked themselves up by their bootstraps. And then that frontier moved further west, and so his big announcement in 1893 was that the U.S. Census had just declared that looking at the data from 1890, that there no longer was a single line of frontier in America. So you couldn't take a pen, start in Canada, and draw south to Mexico and not touch some quote-unquote civilized part.
The West was closed.
The West was closed, right? And that really inspired Teddy Roosevelt to really think about, like, where's the new frontier? Moving west and looking at the Pacific. So if we think about Chicago, sort of at that vortex of thinking about, here's Christopher Columbus, an explorer, opening up a frontier, and here's Chicago opening up a frontier, and here's America and its great industrial might, showing that it's finally come. This is the fruit of the democratic experience. And then people all say, where do we take the democratic experience next? And a lot of that was like, oh, look at all these territories we have recently acquired. So it's kind of interesting thing.
That is, and now I mean, it makes perfect sense that Chicago would end up with that, and it's like that entire section of the country was finally arriving. And go back once again to the Olympics as a comparison. The Olympics are usually kind of like gifted only to countries that have, you're not going to get a developing nation's not going to get the Olympics. It's like when China got the Olympics in 2008, it was seen as a big moment for them of, we've made it to the world stage, that we are now a fully recognized country and that we actually have something to share. I mean, never mind that we bulldozed a bunch of people's houses just to build this, but Olympic Village and stuff. But
they did that in Chicago too. They had those things.
And wasn't the Chicago Fair? I don't know if it was unique in this way, but didn't they it was like plaster of Paris made most of the buildings, right? So they could demolish it. It wasn't like, if you go to the New York's World Fair of the 60s, they still have Shea Stadium. They still have the big, from Men in Black. Those things are still there. And in Seattle, the Space Needle is still there. And in Knoxville, the Sun Sphere is still there as landmarks for these places now. And that didn't seem to be
park because they bulldozed it. It was called the White City. There was so much plaster used, and it looked like a whole city because of all these different buildings. But so that Soldier Stadium and that park where if you go to see the museum in Chicago, there's a big silver beam, right? So that's all on the edge of that huge park that was just filled with all these buildings, temporary buildings.
It's incredible. I love that about cities, really anywhere, but cities you find it the most, where it's like the layers of history, and sometimes they're very much specifically identified. They're like, this is, and so many times when you're in a city, you're just going back and forth, but you don't recognize these things as holdovers or even symbols of, like, to remind you of something. It's not, and so like I love that. I'm looking forward to this summer. This Christmas we're going out to Chicago. I've never been to Chicago, but we are going to go to Chicago for the first time and explore around a little bit there. And I'm excited because it does have so much of this history behind it as being, like you said, the second city, but in some regards maybe even taking the torch from New York as the city that is really American, because New York is so Atlantic. It's so informed and always has been by Europe, and Chicago is so uniquely American. It's in the center of the country. It's on the Great Lakes. It's not on the ocean. It's like it has.
It's got the railroads.
Right. It's a railroad hub. So thank you so much for taking the time. Popular culture, by definition, connects and unites us, and proves that people of different backgrounds, in fact, have a lot in common with one another. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, at least in part, for that reason. If it connects with you and you'd like to add to it, or any of the podcast episodes, just visit everything-history.com and search for the Everything as a Primary Source project, which can be found in the classroom section of the website. We'd love to hear what you have to say. Be sure to rate and share this podcast wherever you are listening to it now, and follow Everything as a Primary Source on social media, including YouTube and especially Instagram. Thank you for listening to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source.